introduce today's webinar on prosecutions of wage theft and other employer crimes. And I want to start by extending a warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the Economic Policy Institute and the Economic Analysis and Research Network, otherwise known as EARN, which is EPI's nationwide network of research, policy, and advocacy organizations at the state and local level. My name is Jen Shearer. I recently joined EARN and EPI as a senior state policy coordinator for our new Worker Power project. And the topic of today's webinar is core to our mission at EPI and EARN. And so I want to express how excited we are to be partnering with special guest Terry Gerstein, not only in hosting today's webinar, but in ongoing joint work to strengthen enforcement of labor standards, build worker power, and to bring about a post-pandemic world in which all work truly has dignity. We want to quickly turn it over to Terry Gerstein, who is here with us. She is the director of the State and Local Enforcement Project at the Harvard Law School Labor and Work-Life Program. She recently completed an Open Society Foundation's Leadership and Government Fellowship, and prior to that worked for over 17 years enforcing labor laws in New York State, and prior to that as a nonprofit lawyer representing immigrant workers in Florida. Her writing has been widely published, and today we are thrilled to have Terry here to host discussion of her newly released report on how district attorneys and state attorneys general are fighting workplace abuses. Thank you, Terry, for joining us.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As Jennifer mentioned, I am a senior fellow at the Economic Policy Institute, as well as the other work that she described. And I also worked in the New York AG's office as the Labor Bureau Chief for a number of years, where we brought both civil and criminal cases against employers for violating workplace laws. And today we're going to have a conversation about the growing trend of criminal prosecution of wage theft, unemployment tax evasion, workplace safety and health violations, labor trafficking, and other employer crimes against workers. This conversation, as you heard, is happening in conjunction with the report that we just issued, which I would recommend that you read, even if I hadn't written it. If you're interested in the topic, I highly recommend reading it. This development of prosecutors getting involved in these issues is relatively new. Historically, prosecutors have not gotten involved in prosecuting crimes against workers. That has generally been, violations of labor law have generally been the purview of civil enforcement and lawsuits. There have been cases of law enforcement or police, for example, getting involved in workers in various instances, like arresting strikers, going back to the Triangle Shirtwaist fire, before the Triangle Shirtwaist factory, before the fire, when there were strikes, and many other replicas of that throughout the past decades. But historically, it's been less common for prosecutors to bring charges against employers for violating workers' rights. But that is something that has become, that has been changing in recent years. And there's a growing number of district attorneys and attorneys general who have been bringing cases against employers. What kinds of cases are they bringing? They're bringing wage theft cases against employers who just don't pay workers altogether for a month or 2 months of work performed, who alter time cards to reduce work hours represented, who keep 2 sets of books to avoid paying overtime, demand kickbacks from workers. They're bringing unemployment insurance tax evasion cases for employers who underreport the number of workers that they have in order to cheat on their UI taxes. Prosecutors are bringing workers' comp fraud cases involving employers who don't get workers' comp insurance, or who, again, grossly understate the number of workers that they have in their business, which leaves workers in a terrible position when they get injured on the job. Some prosecutors have brought cases involving workplace sexual assault. We know in the era of Me Too, how the disparities of power between workers and employers can lead to some really awful situations, and in some cases rising to a level that constitutes sexual assault. They have brought labor trafficking cases, and you're going to hear about a recent successful prosecution of a labor trafficking case in Minneapolis. And also they brought cases involving workplace safety and health. This is something that during the pandemic is so much more front of mind for so many of us. But even before the pandemic, too many workers were getting injured and killed on the job. Some of them in situations that were really, really preventable and completely predictable. And so some of those cases have been brought as criminal prosecutions involving roofers who weren't tied off, or workers in trenches that weren't shored off. In addition, when I was the labor bureau chief in the New York AG's office, we brought some workplace safety and health cases under child labor statutes involving, for example, a teenager whose arm was severed when he was working on machinery that children are not allowed to work on. And then a final type of case involves retaliation cases where employers retaliate or conduct witness tampering or otherwise interfere with workers and try to silence workers who've come forward. The context in which these kinds of violations occurs is highlighted, is outlined in the report. Each one of these could be its own webinar, but the context involves high rates of violations of most workplace laws, very low union density nationally, particularly in the private sector, because our labor laws make it so hard for workers to unionize. And this affects working conditions in many, many ways. But in terms of basic compliance, unions operate as a worksite monitor where they are present on a worksite. And when they're not, they still end up raising standards in a given industry. Forced arbitration has prevented so many workers from being able to access judge and jury because they have to go to secretive arbitration. Our agencies, both at the state and federal level, for enforcement are severely underfunded. And so in all of this context, criminal prosecutors are getting involved where we have precarious working conditions, high rates of violation, and insufficient recourse and deterrence of violations. So there's real untapped potential for DA offices to make a difference in this area. The impact of wage theft, of course, is it impacts workers themselves, obviously, but also their communities. It affects people's health. It affects housing. We had a case involving a home health aide who had not been paid for several months and ended up getting evicted, for example. It affects people's ability to put food on the table. It also impacts law-abiding employers because they have to compete with companies who save money by violating the laws. And it affects our broader community because, for example, social insurance safety nets like unemployment insurance, as we've seen during the pandemic, are critical for so many people. And every employer really needs to pay their fair share into the system for it to work. So we're going to have a really exciting conversation today with our four speakers. All of them are just so knowledgeable and thoughtful about these issues. We're going to start out talking with two district attorneys, Jose Garza and Michael Doherty, and then having a general conversation. And then we're going to have case descriptions of actual cases that have been brought with two frontline prosecutors, Danielle Newsom and Susan Crum. And then we're going to open up for questions. I'll give you a little introduction to each of the people who's speaking today, and then we'll get right into our conversation with Jose and Michael. So Jose Garza was elected the Travis County District Attorney on November 3rd of 2020. So he's been DA. Travis County is where Austin is located. So he's been DA for a little over 6 months. He began his career as a public defender, both in Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid and also as a federal defender in Texas. But he also has extensive labor experience working in the federal government as a deputy general counsel for the House Committee on Education and Labor, as special counsel to the National Labor Relations Board, and a senior policy at the U.S. Department of Labor during the Obama administration. And most recently, he was the executive director of the Worker Defense Project, which is a really active workers' rights and organization and advocacy group in Texas. Michael Doherty has been the Boulder District Attorney since March of 2018. He previously has an extensive career in government, including working around 13 years for the Manhattan DA's office, and then later working for the Colorado AG's office, as the supervisor of the DNA Justice Review Project and Deputy Attorney General of the Criminal Justice Section. And then he was the Assistant District Attorney for the First Judicial District in Colorado. And as I said, is now the DA of Boulder County and has been for about 3 years. Susan Crum comes to us from Hennepin County, Minnesota. In Minnesota, the the offices, which would be DAs and many other places, it's the county attorney. She is a senior assistant county attorney with the Hennepin County Attorney's Office. She has over 30 years of experience as a prosecutor, and she's manager for the Complex Crimes Unit, which is a team of attorneys who prosecute complex financial crimes, including financial crimes that have vulnerable adult victims, identity theft, labor trafficking, and more. And then finally, we have Danielle Newsom, who joined the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office in September 2019 as an assistant district attorney and labor liaison to launch the office's new worker protection subunit. Previously, she worked extensively within the labor movement. She was a staff attorney for New Jersey's largest healthcare union, and before that, an associate at a Philadelphia labor and employment law firm representing public and private sector unions. And before law school, she worked as an organizer with unions, including the United Food and Commercial Workers Union. So we have people who have deep experience in criminal prosecution and in the labor world, and I think it's going to be a really great conversation. So let's start out. We'll start out with the conversation with Michael and Jose. And I guess I'll start with you, Michael. Could you just share a little bit about your background and why doing these kinds of workers' rights and wage theft cases was of interest to you as DA?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is great to be here. And Terry, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm excited to be a small part of this conversation today. It is such an incredibly important area that we continue to see developing in the criminal justice system. For me personally, I grew up in a blue collar family. I was a union employee when I was loading trucks at UPS during college. And throughout my career, I've always recognized that we could do better. We could do more to protect our workers, particularly those who are low wage immigrant workers who may be viewed as more vulnerable by unscrupulous employers. And in 2018, when I had the honor of becoming district attorney for Boulder County here in Colorado, Terry and I had connected, and Terry had been speaking with me about some of the efforts underway in other parts of the country to improve the justice system's response to abuses against workers, including wage theft. So since taking office in 2018, we've made it a priority for this office, and I look forward to talking to you more about the legislation we've been involved in, because we've taken some really significant steps as a state. But I come at this because I recognize that if someone were to steal an individual's cell phone, the criminal justice system has a very good response in terms of those cases are handled by law enforcement. They're brought to the DA's office. We have laws that fit squarely within that response. And wage theft, which obviously has a far greater impact on the individual victim, has not been handled as well as a general theft case. So recognizing that workers are being victimized, and it has an impact not only on them, but on their families and communities. And when we're out talking to immigrants in our communities, and I talk about wage theft, hands go up all throughout the room. And that's why the efforts underway by Terry and other allies on this call today are so important. And I'm honored to be here today.
Thank you, Michael. How about you, Jose? Why is this issue? You've been DA for about 6 months. You have an ambitious agenda. Why is this an issue that's of interest to you as DA of Travis County?
Terry, it's so good to see you again, and good to be with you in this incredible panel. Looking forward to our discussion with Michael and Danielle and Susan. At the end of the day, prosecuting these offenses will make our community more safe. These are important to me because this is about our public safety as a community. We're having an important conversation all across the country right now about what public safety is. And I think we all know through our lived experiences and because of the data, what public safety is. Public safety is access to good schools. Public safety is access to good jobs, to healthcare. What public safety is stability. And when employers steal wages from working people, when they violate health and safety standards that create dangerous work environments that lead to workers' injuries or death, what that does is create instability in that family. It creates instability in that neighborhood, and that instability makes us less safe. So prosecuting these offenses is really, at the end of the day, about our public safety as a community.
And Jose, in the time that you've you've taken office, how are you thinking of getting started? The office previously hadn't been involved in workers' rights cases or prosecuting wage theft or safety issues. How are you thinking about getting started in this work? And what kinds of cases might be of interest to your office, and how will your team go about finding them? And how are you thinking about getting this work started from an office that previously hadn't been doing it?
Well, I feel so fortunate to have had the opportunity over the course of my career to learn from so many experts like you, Terry, like others. You know that one of the things I worked on at the Department of Labor was working with United States attorneys' offices across the country to try to encourage them to bring criminal cases where there were wage violations, health and safety violations. But as you said, it's a different kind of work at the state level, and so we are working to learn. We're learning from people like Michael, from other state prosecutors across the country who have brought these kinds of cases. We're excited to be working with our partners at the Department of Labor in the Wage and Hour Division and at OSHA. And we are talking to working people in our community to have an understanding of the conduct that's happening on workplaces, to have an understanding of how it's impacting the economy, how it's impacting the health and safety, and ultimately the stability of people in our community. And so that's the work we are doing. And with respect to the kinds of cases that we are interested in, I think we can talk about this a little bit more extensively, but generally speaking, obviously, first and foremost, we're interested in criminal conduct. There is more of it out there than I think most people would think. But we want to be judicious about how we use the weight of our criminal legal system. We are not interested in prosecuting low-level working people, again, because doing that creates instability in households and community, which makes us less safe. But we are keenly aware of actors in our economy who have a long history or a pattern and practice of criminal conduct that makes people less safe, that results in stolen wages. And so we are working with partners to ensure that actors, particularly at the higher end of the economic food chain, who are engaged in criminal conduct, know that there will be consequences if they continue to break the law. And what our hope is by being strategic in the use of our authority, that we can have a deterrent effect on other actors in our economy.
And you said that that your office has been talking to people and out there. And what kinds of things are you and your team hearing about what's happening out there? And some of this also is from what you know from your prior experience as the executive director working with workers.
Well, we know wage theft is pervasive. As the executive director of Workers Defense Project, we were focused primarily on wage theft in the construction industry. We knew that 1 in 5 workers in the construction industry in the state of Texas has been a victim of wage theft. That is self-reported. My strong suspicion is that it's a higher rate, but we're just not able to talk to as many workers as we can. And we know that, during this pandemic, I've been so grateful for all of you who have been working, to ensure that everyone remembers how essential every working person is. But many of us have been working at home. Many portions of the economy slowed during the pandemic. But there are other industries like construction and others where that work has continued, and where there have been even less people to monitor that work and to keep up with conditions in that work. So we're all sort of slowly starting, as the economy opens back up, to get back to being able to conduct investigations in person, and to really put eyes on the state of our economy and the state of working people. And so we're as we go. I'm not surprised by the amount of work coming to our desk, and we'll slowly make our way through it.
And Michael, how about you? Can you tell us a little bit about what your office has been doing in this area? There's both the casework and there's educating other DAs about the work, and then there's the legislative effort, successful legislative effort. So I don't know where you want to start, but if you could talk a little bit about what your office has been doing.
Thank you, Terry. And I think Jose hit on a lot of the key points for us as prosecutors in the justice system. I would add that for us here in Colorado, it's about recognizing that no one should be paid less than what they've earned. And that in Colorado, we were losing up to $750 million per year in stolen wages. So the impact that it has on low income, low wage workers, particularly immigrants and those who are viewed, as I said, as more vulnerable, has been incredibly profound. So we've worked to improve the laws by going to the legislature, and we fought successfully for wage theft to be raised to a higher level offense. Previously, if someone stole your cell phone, they'd be subject to a higher sentence than if someone stole your wages. So we were successful in going to the legislature and getting the law changed that we have an appropriate amount of charges to bring when someone does commit wage theft. We're in the process right now, and I don't want to jinx it, but it's on the right track. The legislative session's about to end. And I think when it ends, we'll have a new law, or excuse me, an improvement on the books for individuals who threaten someone with immigration consequences if they report a crime to law enforcement. So we've had that come up in cases where we had a general contractor defraud subcontractors. And when they said they were going to go to the police, he said, if you go to the police, I'll go to ICE. And in my mind, that should be treated the same as any other extortion offense. So the legislature, up to this point, this session, and I think it's about to pass, has agreed with that. And our office pushed for that and got the district attorneys from around the state to join in unanimous support of that bill. It's also about raising awareness. And in my mind, that has to be done in a number of different ways. So being out in the community as much as possible and talking about our commitment to standing up and fighting for workers has been a priority. And as a result, we generate more cases because people are aware that we care and aware that we have the tools in the justice system to help them. And we've provided trainings at the local level so that law enforcement doesn't dismiss complaints by saying simply that sounds civil in nature, go somewhere else. They know that our office is available to help victims of wage theft. And with Terry's help and help from others around the state, we've actually put on statewide trainings for other district attorneys so that all of the offices in Colorado have the information available to them on how to protect workers and what we could do to better protect workers. So we've been doing that as well. So legislation and raising awareness, but also really connecting with unions and advocacy groups for workers so that they can help us connect with individuals who are being victimized and they can bring cases to our attention. So we've done a lot of outreach to advocacy groups for immigrants and union reps. I just met with another one last week, just checking in about people who are being victimized and what we could do to help them. So we're very active in what I would say is generally viewed as employment law, but certainly has a crossover to criminal law. And then finally, the casework side, recognizing it's a priority for our office. We have a unit that is specially designated to handle any complaints of crimes against workers and wage theft offenses in our community protection division, and they do terrific work. So it's about raising awareness, improving the laws, and also making sure we carry through on our promises in making protecting workers a priority for our community.
Thanks, Michael. And are there any cases that you can share with us? That story about the contractor who threatened the subcontractors is pretty chilling. Are there other stories that you could share with us about cases or a case that your office has brought?
So that's a good question. And the reason I mentioned that one is because it's the case that was the impetus for us going in the legislature and fighting for that improvement in the law in terms of how wage theft is classified. That was a case where a general contractor had scammed subcontractors out of monies that they had earned and then threatened them with immigration consequences. So at the time, we did not have a wage theft offense that was a felony offense. We do now, because we went to the legislature after that case and used that case as an example in pushing the legislators to make this change. We continue to receive complaints from the community about wage theft. It's very much a focus for our office. And also we had a case last year involving extortion, where an individual is being threatened with immigration consequences if she went to law enforcement. And that's where the idea came for improving the extortion statute to cover the threat of immigration consequences. And we continue to see these cases coming in. And I think it's about raising awareness and letting people know we're here to work on these cases.
And there's so many threads to follow up on in what you said in your comments so far. One of them that I'd love to hear both of your thoughts about is the relationship of immigrant workers who being the victims in these cases. And there are all kinds of obstacles for immigrants to come forward and report violations to law enforcement, to DA offices, to government in any form. And how have your offices, or what plans do you have? And maybe we'll start with you, Jose. What plans do you have? And how do you think a DA office or government office can work to overcome those obstacles?
Well, there is, I think, rightfully an enormous amount of distrust by immigrant communities to law enforcement generally. And first, it starts by recognizing that fact and really working to get to know immigrant communities and to let them know that, one, we take these kinds of offenses very seriously on the one hand, and on the other hand, to let them know that that in our office, all people, particularly members of our immigrant community, are welcome, and that we are working to ensure that no one is treated differently by our criminal legal system because of their status. I think that's a key part of starting to build trust with people in immigrant communities, particularly undocumented communities. It's going to take work, and it will be a process, but we're going to do it case by case, relationship by relationship. And Terry, I've spent my entire career fighting side by side with our immigrant community, particularly with undocumented workers here in Texas, and they are an incredibly vital part of our community, of our neighborhoods, of our economy. And so we have a real obligation. It is in the interest of the safety of our community to make sure that immigrants and people, regardless of their status, feel welcomed and understand that our criminal legal system will protect them too.
Michael, do you have anything to add?
Well, I think Jose is absolutely right. And that community awareness piece is really important, because we can't investigate these cases if we don't know what's happening out there. So we have an immigrant protection program in our office. We go out in the community all the time and we talk about the fact that if a victim or witness is concerned about immigration consequences, we assure them and we promise them that all the law enforcement agencies in both the county and the district attorney's office will not report their immigration status to the federal government. We do not share that information out. We have a robust U visa program. We want victims to come forward. We want witnesses to come forward knowing that justice should be done for everyone. So we really do push hard to do that and to make sure that community members and workers are aware of it. So we do a lot of education in the employment community to make sure, and for immigrants to make sure the word's out there. And the reason I say that, it should be obvious, but I'll just stress it. If one of my staff members here at the district attorney's office doesn't get her check on Friday, she's going to let us know. And if I say that's too bad, you're just not getting it, that she's not going to let it go. She's going to do something about it. So it's the employers who think they can take advantage of their employees, who believe they're cut off from the justice system, that are really the ones perpetrating these acts. So it's about raising awareness in workers and also other government agencies that are connecting with workers to let them know that that's criminal activity that we take very seriously and that we're going to stand up and fight for the immigrants in our community.
So both of you, in terms of doing this work, there are sort of some skepticism of it from a few different angles, right? There's historically, these cases have not been done criminally, and there's a sense that like, oh, that's just civil, like you haven't been paid, go file in small claims court. So why do you think these cases So that's one set of criticisms. I'll ask you about that first. The other is sort of coming at it from a criminal justice reform perspective, that this is a moment of examining so much about our criminal justice system. And, reformers are really focused on shrinking the footprint of the criminal justice system, while this is something that would potentially expand it. So, those are sort of very different kinds of critiques of this kind of work, but I'd love to maybe start out hearing your thoughts about, why is this criminal? Why is this not just a civil matter? Michael, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, why is it criminal is someone is having their wages stolen from them. And I think it's pretty clear right now, we probably have someone being arrested for shoplifting a bar of soap at a store. And we could talk about whether that's the best use of resources or not. And I think we overcriminalize some of those offenses, quite frankly, but that's viewed as a criminal offense. So how is it that that person might be working 60 hours a week and then doesn't get their check at the end of the week, and we tell them, sorry, you have to go to the civil system for any recourse? When if they're stealing something from the store because they don't have a paycheck, we're prosecuting them criminally. To me, it's about recognizing that there are inequities in the system, and that these folks are victims of theft, and we shouldn't just simply shuffle them off to a civil system that's going to be just as difficult and burdensome for them to navigate, and not give them the justice that they really deserve.
Anything to add, Jose?
Sure. During my career as a public defender down on the border, what I saw were a couple of things. One, I saw a criminal legal system in this country that weighs most heavily on working class people and people of color. I spent a lot of time in state and federal jails and prisons down on the Texas-Mexico border, and I can assure you that those jails and prisons are not filled with the middle class, they're not filled with the wealthy. They are largely filled with working class, with working poor, and with communities of color. What I also saw working on the border is that the way we use our criminal legal system, by and large, in this country, is as a rug. When we fail someone through our broken and inequitable education system, when we fail someone because of our broken mental health care system, when we fail someone because of our inequitable economy in this country, when they fail because we fail them, what we do is sweep them under the rug of our criminal legal system so we don't have to see or face our own failures. That's what I saw working as a public defender. Working in Congress, working at the National Labor Relations Board. Well, let me just say, starting in Congress, one of the first pieces of legislation we worked on was to improve and enhance criminal penalties for violations of the Mine Safety Act. And the reason why, and many of you are familiar with this case, we won't name names, but there was an explosion in West Virginia that killed far too many people, that was preceded by a series of criminal violations that led to the deaths of those working people. And those two examples were a clear juxtaposition of how our legal system works in this country. That is, if you are poor, if you are a person of color, and you commit anything close to a criminal act, we will throw the book at you. But if you are white, if you are privileged, if you have wealth, our criminal legal system won't touch you. And so part of the reform that people have been asking for all over this country is to bring more balance to our criminal legal system, is to have a system that spends as much of its time and resources lifting up working class communities and communities of color as it does locking them up. And that makes clear that if you break the law, regardless of your wealth, regardless of your title, you will be held accountable. And so it is absolutely, I think, consistent with our overall, with the aspirations of our community to reimagine and reform our criminal justice system to make sure that we hold powerful actors accountable.
Michael, do you have anything to add in terms of how this fits into a reform orientation toward criminal justice work?
Honestly, I think Jose just captured it in really powerful fashion. I agree 100% with how he just described it.
And in terms of both of your backgrounds, you both had a really different path to taking on, taking leadership on this issue as DA. Michael with a long history working in prosecutor's office and in the government, and Jose coming from labor and community organizations and a public defender. How do each of you feel like, maybe Michael, you could start, how do you feel like that background informs your approach to this work?
Well, from my perspective, it allows me to have conversations with law enforcement and prosecutors around the state about why this should be a priority and why I think we've done a disservice or not as much as we should be doing for victims of wage theft in our time in the justice system, or in my time in the justice system. So I look at the unanimous support of all the district attorneys in the state of Colorado for the wage theft legislation and also this year's extortion legislation. And them agreeing that those have to be priority bills for us as district attorneys. And I think that comes from a career in which I've been able to evaluate how the justice system is working and where it's failing and what we can do to improve, and then being able to have those conversations with individuals. So being able to sit down with police officers and say, here's why this case should be important. Here's why we should dedicate more resources. I understand we're in a world of limited resources and we're trying to shrink the footprint of the justice system, but here's why these cases are too important to ignore, and we're doing a disservice to the workers in our community if we do ignore them. So I think having that perspective has really helped me, and I think just bringing a passion to it is what we really need to improve the justice system's response for our workers.
How about you, Jose? You come from, again, not from a prosecutorial background. How does that inform your work now as DA?
Well, first of all, we have some of the best prosecutors, I would say, in the state, in our office here in the Travis County District Attorney's Office. I'm really grateful to the team we have of career prosecutors who are phenomenal lawyers and really dedicated public servants. But, from a general perspective, we have been hiring one kind of prosecutor in this country for about the last 200 years, and that is career prosecutors. And what it has gotten us is the largest rates of incarceration in the country, with little to no impact on the rate of violent crime in this country. We are locking up more people than any other country in the world, and it's not making us more safe. And so, again, I think we've seen all across the country, in red states and blue states and urban states and rural states, that people want a different approach to their criminal justice system. They want common sense things like treating substance use disorder as the public health crisis that it is, as opposed to wasting resources attempting to arrest and prosecute our way out of that problem. But I think my set of experiences overall, I think with humility, have given me two important perspectives. One, it has allowed me to see up close how broken our criminal legal system is, how broken our labor and employment laws are in this country, which haven't been updated in 100 years. And it has allowed me to see the real power that regular people have in communities all across this country to change the politics of their community, to change their state, and most certainly to change their criminal justice system. And so, I approach this work with a keen sense of disappointment about our failures, but also with a real sense of hope and optimism in what regular, real people, working people are capable of if we could give them the kind of legal system that they deserve, and one that empowers them to make the changes they need in their own lives.
Thanks, Jose. I will note here that I once spoke after Jose at an EARN Network conference, and that was a really unfortunate position to be in, because you don't really want to go after Jose. Thank you so much for sharing that perspective. just a couple last questions, and then we'll go on to the two case studies. One is that in the report, and I should note also for the audience that the report, we're focusing a lot on wage theft in this conversation, but the report also talks about unemployment tax evasion, workers' comp fraud, workplace safety and health prosecutions, and a number of other issues. So even though our conversation has been focusing on wage theft, certainly if you look at the report, you'll be able to learn about prosecutions of other kinds of issues. So I have two final questions. One is, to the extent that there is an increase now in DAs taking this on, why do you think that's happening right now? Either one of you, whoever unmutes first.
Well, I mean, I'll just say quickly, I think the people have spoken. And I think working people in communities all across the country are fed up, that they have been victims of wage theft, that they have been hurt or injured on the job, and they're tired of no one ever being held accountable for it. As I said, our federal labor laws, and God bless all of the incredible women at the Department of Labor, at the National Labor Relations Board, in state departments of labor who do this work every day and do it well, but they're outmanned, they're out-resourced, out on the job, out on work sites. And I think people are fed up with it. And so it's our responsibility, all of us, to hear that and respond to it.
What do you think, Michael?
Well, I agree with Jose, and I would point out that over the past couple of years throughout the country, we're seeing more and more DAs being elected who are committed to rooting out the inequities in the justice system. This goes hand in hand with that. And also part of it is for the individuals who engage in and commit wage theft, it's never a one-time act. So in the justice system, we're often prosecuting offenses that are a one-time act. Someone drives drunk, someone gets into a fight, things that happen one time. And I think the justice system is starting to get better at helping people get back on the right track. But we continue to prosecute people who do one thing, commit one mistake. Wage theft and crimes against workers tend to be something that the perpetrators engage in over and over and over again. Individuals don't usually steal their employees' checks just once. So recognizing the damaging impact that these individuals are having on the workers, their families, and the communities is something that I think DAs are becoming more aware of. And certainly in Colorado, we've done a lot to raise awareness with Terry's help in the prosecution community.
And my final question for both of you is, what advice do you have? It's kind of a two-part question. What advice do you have for DA's offices that are interested in getting started in this area and taking this on? And what advice do you have for worker advocacy groups or unions or worker organizations who would like to engage with their DA's office and either have never had any contact, or the DA kind of says, like, that's civil, like, we're not doing that?
Reach out to Terry.
Well, what other advice?
Any PI. Well, I think, no, but there's a real learning component to this. I mean, you've said it repeatedly. This is not a well-established, practice of law with 50 years, from coast to coast of experience. This is something that we are doing and learning together. Most criminal statutes addressing wage theft are relatively new. As you've pointed out, this focus is new. And so it really does, it's a big part of our job and our profession as attorneys, but it takes putting in the work to learn, not just from experts like you and EPI and people like Michael who have done this successfully in states, in jurisdictions across the country. But, just to return to the same point, it's also about listening to the working people in your community, whether that be through their representatives, through labor and other worker centers, or just out on work sites, listening to people who do the jobs that we all depend on every single day.
Thanks, Jose. And I just want to be clear, it is fine for people to reach out to me, but I did want to elicit a more detailed answer, elaborating than just reach out to Terry. And one other thing also that I wanted to note is that you talked about wage theft statutes, but a lot of the cases have been brought under just general penal statutes like larceny or filing a false document or witness tampering or theft of services, theft by swindle, all different kinds of statutes that are already on the books. Michael, what advice do you have for worker advocates or for DAs wanting to get involved in this work?
Well, what I would say is all the things that we've talked about up to this point in the discussion, all the progress that we've made here in Colorado came with no extra budget dollars for our office. So it's all about strong partnerships. So I appreciate that Jose just referenced Terry, and I think Terry's key and also the other folks we've worked with on this effort have made this possible. So we've had statewide trainings for the DAs all around Colorado at no extra expense to our office. We would not have been able to do this alone. It's about the strong partnerships that allow us to raise awareness, improve training, and secure changes to the laws that allow us to enable us to stand up and fight for workers. So that's the part that I would say is it's really not just large metropolitan offices that can do this. It's an office the size of ours here in Boulder County and elsewhere, where through strong partnerships and alliances, we could do a lot more to protect the workers in this country.
If I could just, it's such an important point that Michael raises, and I want to talk about one of the challenges and then why, what Michael just identified is so important. The overwhelming majority of district attorney offices or state's attorney offices across the country do not conduct investigations ourselves. We rely on law enforcement to investigate cases and bring them to us. It is relatively uncommon for local police departments or sheriff's offices to really have the capacity to conduct these kinds of investigations. I think it's something that we're all working towards. I know here in Travis County, there's a real willingness from our law enforcement partners to learn. But as we build that capacity, the kinds of partnerships that Michael was identifying are so crucial. It's how these cases get worked up. If you can, and there are items to be careful about, obviously, when you partner with other law enforcement agencies, but if you can partner with your state Department of Labor or your state workforce commission or wage and hour at the federal level, partner with working people on the ground, it's a really important step to get the facts you need that form the basis of a case.
And Terry, one thing I wanted to mention with an eye towards what Jose just touched on is we worked with the Public Rights Project to secure a fellowship. So Alex Cardenas, who's on this call and helped organize my being a part of this talk today, is being paid by the Public Rights Project, and he's working on our office. He's dedicated to wage theft cases and raising awareness in the community. So that's the kind of thing when you're looking for partnerships and grant opportunities, there are things out there to allow us to form these alliances to do better for workers.
Thank you. And this is a really great segue to talking about the particular cases, because I think both of the cases we're going to talk about came through relationships with community. But before switching gears and talking about the case studies, I want to add one more point to what both of you said about funding, which is that these cases actually can be revenue generating, because in many instances, there are employers who haven't paid their unemployment insurance taxes or payroll taxes. And in fact, in California and New York, there are funding programs that are used. In New York, it's the Crimes Against Revenue program, which is used for a number of different kinds of crimes that affect revenue, but among them, unemployment insurance cases can be brought. So these cases can actually be revenue generating. But that's a sort of small point. The broader point is the point about working, that these cases are likely to come in from community partners or partners in civil law enforcement agencies. And that's sort of how most of the cases will be generated. So Michael and Jose, stay tuned because we'll have some Q&A at the end, but let's turn it over to Danielle, who's going to tell us about a wage theft case that she's been working on, that her office brought. It's not yet finished, so she can't say everything about it, but she'll give a little description of the case. I'll maybe ask her a few questions, and then Susan Crum will talk about a labor trafficking case in Minneapolis, or in the Twin Cities. So Danielle.
Thank you, Terry. And I know here in Philadelphia, DA Krasner factored in many of the same considerations that Jose and Michael talked about in their remarks when deciding to bring me on and start prosecuting these crimes. So I'm going to jump into an example of my first prosecution, actually, now that I'm an ADA and labor liaison in Philadelphia. So this case was referred to my office in October of 2019, which is just a month after I actually joined the office to start our worker protection subunit. And it was an attorney for a local building trades union who reached out about a wage theft case involving an employer who was a signatory contractor to the union's contracts. And the broader fact pattern is that the employer fell behind on contributions to the union's health and retirement funds and stopped remitting dues money and other employee wage deductions to the union. Then, after a year of failing to catch up on those payments while the amount of debt increased, the employer filed for bankruptcy, leaving a debt of hundreds of thousands of dollars to the union and the associated funds. So, after hearing that from the union, I did have some concerns about considering this case for my first prosecution, but I asked them to provide me with some evidence that I could review and then make an initial decision. And I say an initial decision because there are several steps throughout the process in which we might have to decide to stop moving forward with a potential prosecution. But in this first step, I really wanted to see if this was a case that we should at least assign to a detective to investigate further. So after going through everything and speaking with my supervisors, who are experienced financial crimes prosecutors, we did decide to take the case, but we made it very clear to the union that our criminal investigation would focus only on the money that was actually deducted from the employee's pay and never turned over to their union. It was very clear that the workers did not know that their payroll deductions that came out of their checks every week were not going to their union, and it was ultimately their money that they had worked for and earned. So it came down to an 11-month period in which the employer deducted union dues, he deducted political, social, apprenticeship fund fees from all of his employees who were union represented, and that money never made it over to the union. So over the course of that 11 months, about 37 different workers had worked for this employer, and over $110,000 was taken from them in total. And once we agreed to take the case, it was assigned to an in-house district attorney detective, because this is not a case that came from our local police. And the detective who was assigned had never worked on this type of employment-based crime, because very new, our first case. So initially he was overwhelmed by the volume of payroll documents. Some of them were union forms, some were company payroll records. There were some certified payroll records from prevailing wage construction jobs. And it was just a lot of different things to go through. So, I worked it out, and the union was helpful in helping me understand all the documents so that I could then break it down and explain the different records to the detective so that he could then lead the investigation and start questioning witnesses about the amount of wage theft and how we could prove this criminal case. And once we got on the same page about that, and we understood the documents, we started reaching out to witnesses. COVID came in and shut our investigation down for several months. But eventually things got back on track. And since it was our first case, we decided that, we would just keep it simple and just, focus on the facts and what we needed to prove to bring this prosecution forward. So I created a spreadsheet that compiled all of the information from the hundreds of pages of payroll documents. And it showed how much money was deducted from each worker each pay period. So, this is 37 workers and they were paid weekly. So for every week, I broke it down by their total wage and benefits package, the total number of hours worked, and then, their dues rate is based on a percentage of that total package of wage and benefits. The other employee deductions were based on a percentage, either a percentage of their total package or based on the number of hours worked, a certain amount per hour. So, created a spreadsheet, did all of those calculations, and it showed exactly how much was deducted from each worker over this course of these 11 months. And, I had that in order, and the detective started reaching out to all 37 of these workers because we needed to get confirmation from them that they did not give the employer permission to use this money for anything other than turning it over to their union. This is money that they earned that showed up on their pay stubs every week as deductions, and it sort of just vanished, and they didn't know why or where it went. So we reached out to the workers. We were able to contact many of them. Most of them gave us statements and agreed to come forward as witnesses if we needed them, either at a preliminary hearing or to testify at a trial. And we had enough at that point to get an arrest warrant. And we reached out to the employer, and he agreed to turn himself in. And he came in, he was processed and arrested. And from there, things are still working their way through court. We are at the stage where we are past the preliminary hearing. The employer actually agreed to waive his preliminary hearing. And we have an agreement that we will resolve this case through one of our diversionary programs. And that will involve the employer paying back the entire amount of restitution that is owed to these workers and their union. And there will be probation and community service involved. And if he does not comply with those terms, then we will be able to move forward with the case and go to trial and prosecute him for taking this money from these workers. So I'll leave it there and turn it back to Terry.
I'm muted, sorry about that. So one question is that this case was referred by, it's a little different from what people think of as a typical wage theft case in that, but I will note there have been a number of cases like this where employers deduct money for workers' pay to be used for pension money, to be used for health insurance, to be used in this case for union dues. And then instead of remitting it to the right place, the employer just keeps the money. So it's not that, this is not a very unusual form of wage theft, but I think it's not what people immediately envision when they think of wage theft. But given that the case came from a union and it related to the employer keeping union dues, did that raise any concerns for your office about, potentially seeming that you weren't doing your own independent work, but that you were just like trying to help out a union? You're muted.
Sorry about that. I mentioned that I initially had some concerns about moving forward with this as my first case. And that was one of the reasons I did not want to be seen as a debt collector for the union. And we had to really figure out, what's the right balance here, because, when many people think wage theft, they think low wage workers, where these are fairly high paid construction workers. If you think about not only their hourly rate, but the benefits that they receive. But after looking at the facts, it really just boiled down to the employer took this money from their paychecks and ran with it. And since there was so much evidence, it really was a good first case, because not only did we have it on paper, but we also had the witnesses to back it up. Another concern for me was that there was already a pending bankruptcy proceeding involving this employer. So, I thought, do I really want to get involved here where, they're already partially handling this through the civil process? Do we need to make this a criminal case? But the workers were not able to get any recovery for the money that was taken from their wages through the bankruptcy. And we were actually able to use the employer's deposition from the bankruptcy hearing, where he admitted that, yeah, the money was deducted and he never turned it over to the union. So that was pretty strong evidence in our favor, which was another reason why it made sense to move forward with the case.
Thank you. Anything else you want to add about the case? Just any updates about the current status of it, because it's ongoing?
Well, I will say, once we considered offering the diversionary program as a way to resolve this case, I made sure to reach out to the workers in their union to see if they were okay with that, because they are the victims of this crime. They don't have the final say, but we really do want to consider what makes sense for the victims. And, they were happy that they could get restitution through the criminal process, which we know sometimes in civil cases, restitution doesn't get paid or doesn't get paid in full. Whereas when there's the potential consequence of criminal sanctions involved, we are pretty confident that this money will be paid and go back to the workers who it was stolen from. So I would just say it hasn't fully resolved itself yet, but the employer has been cooperative, once he was arrested, and we'll see where it goes.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that and telling us about that case. So next up, we have Susan Crum from the Hennepin County Attorney's Office talking about what I think is the first labor trafficking conviction in Minnesota. Susan?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having us today, to Terry and the EPI. And I want to echo what Michael and Jose and Danielle all said. One of our challenges here is connecting with law enforcement so that they realize that this is a crime. And it should be investigated, and we need to protect workers as well as the fortunate. Our case involved a labor broker his business model was to misclassify employees, a lot of undocumented individuals. And by misclassifying those employees, he skirted laws meant to protect workers, mandatory workers' compensation insurance, wages, hours, etc. His acts came to light by complaints to our office from both union and non-union worker representatives looking for assistance in how to connect with law enforcement. So we did connect them with a law enforcement agency, the Minnesota Department of Commerce Fraud Bureau, which has state authority and jurisdiction to investigate, and also experience in financial crimes, which is very important, and also experience in both state and federal courts. So we connected these individuals with the Commerce Fraud Bureau, and then as the case investigation progressed, worked with them. And what we learned is that in his criminal business model of misclassifying these workers, several workers were not paid all of their wages. They did not receive overtime. They did not have benefits. Several of them were arrested in a surprise ICE raid early one morning at a home where he knew people that were working for him were living. And in fact, he'd promised that they could live there for free. The home was not in very good shape. There was lots and lots of people living there, no hot water, and then he didn't pay the rent. So when that ICE raid happened, our victim was in ICE custody. The defendant bailed him out, promised to pay for an attorney to deal with Homeland Security, and bailed him out. He then told him, "You owe me money." And in effect, it was debt bondage. You need to work for me to pay off the lawyer who never showed up, was never retained, never represented him, and the bail. And then a couple months later was badly injured on a job site when a wall fell on him, fracturing his spine. When that happened, the workers contacted our defendant, very frantic, because they really needed to take him to the hospital. This was one of the things that his workers were never allowed to do. They were never allowed to seek out any medical attention, because he knew the fact that he had no workers' compensation insurance would come to light. Our victim's medical situation was so dire, the workers went to the hospital anyway. The defendant met them at the hospital and told the victim, "You need to lie about the circumstances under which you were working. You have to say you were at my house. And because, what if they find out you're working? That's illegal. You're going to be deported. They won't care how injured you are or how much pain you're in. They're just going to deport you." So we ended up, our law enforcement agency was fantastic. They did a lot of work. A lot of it is following the money. and being able to prove that these individuals were employees. We ended up charging him with labor trafficking based upon the debt bondage, insurance fraud for the fact that he lied about the fact that he did not have employees, and then also theft by swindle for the fact that public dollars had to be paid out for our victims' medical care because of the fact that the defendant did not have workers' compensation insurance.
And can you tell us what happened in the end in the case? Like what are the workers doing now? What's happening with the defendant?
Certainly. So the first thing that happened that I think is a great message for any public authority that is looking at the importance of this prosecution, this impact, is the general contractor who had hired the subcontractor who hired our labor broker immediately got a call from the media and called our office to tell us, we don't know anything about him. It provides a scrutiny of people that are on the top about the decisions they're making. So they immediately called our office and said, we don't know anything about this, et cetera. But that was an immediate response, and it really sent shockwaves through the construction industry. That you need to do your due diligence in who you're hiring. The defendant, we did have a lot of proceedings, court appearances, many motion hearings, and the day of trial, we did resolve the case with a negotiated plea. He pled guilty to labor trafficking and also to insurance fraud, and is placed on probation for 5 years, got jail time, and also had to pay restitution. The workers, a couple of them, I'm happy to say, were able to obtain T visas to stay in the United States, and had a lot of good support from our local worker-based advocacy group.
And just for people in the audience who aren't familiar with it, T visas, and I think previously someone maybe mentioned U visas. I think Michael mentioned U visas are special visas for victims who are serving as witnesses in certain types of law enforcement cases. This is a question for both Susan and Danielle. Did you have the statutes that you needed to bring these cases, or did you feel like you didn't quite have the tools in terms of the law that was on the books?
Well,
Susan, you go first. Oh, Danielle, go ahead.
Sorry. In Pennsylvania, we have a labor law, the wage payment and collection law, that makes a wage theft a summary offense. But my office, as the City of Philadelphia's prosecutor's office, we don't even handle summary offenses. We only handle misdemeanors for hire. So instead of charging it under that labor law that does have criminal provisions, we charged it under theft. And because the aggregate amount was over $100,000, it was a second-degree felony count for each of the 37 workers. We actually charged 3 different crimes per worker. So we charged theft, theft by deception, and theft by failure to make required disposition of funds. So there were 3 counts, 3 second-degree felony counts for each of the 37 workers charged. So, we were able to find laws that applied to that case, but we have to make sure that the facts will bear out and we can actually prove it.
Right. That's interesting, because in New York, that was something that we always sort of focused on, trying to add other charges to make sure that we had strong enough charges in our cases. And I know in a lot of jurisdictions, the kinds of issues, that if there is a wage theft statute, that it might be a misdemeanor. And a lot of times prosecutors are not necessarily as interested in misdemeanors, which is why I think the reform that happened, legislative reform that Michael helped to spearhead in Colorado was really significant. How about you, Susan? Were the laws sufficient to do what you needed to do?
The labor trafficking statute is relatively recent in the state of Minnesota, and there are some cases that are charged now and pending, but it has not been used a lot. There are no jury instructions that have been developed, and there's no appellate decisions that have helped us in deciphering the language of the statute, which is it's based a lot upon the federal statute, but it's quite unwieldy. As Danielle has mentioned, and I think most prosecutors and individuals involved with the criminal justice system know, usually states have some form of sentencing or ranking, and ours is called the sentencing guidelines. And the labor trafficking statute is not unranked, is unranked under our guidelines. So it's a felony, but it's unranked. So the parties involved here do not have any idea what the possible outcome could be. So that made it very difficult for the parties to decide on, how strong a position you could take. For example, the theft by swindle is a level 6, which is a mandatory, it's a probationary case, a 21-month stayed sentence. But if you're a level 8, like an aggravated robbery, that's a 48-month commit. So knowing where you fall on the guidelines is really important, and that is definitely something that should be addressed.
So one question, I'm going to turn to some of the questions from the audience. One of them is a really simple question, which is who gets the restitution? Do the workers get it or the state? And I think I can just answer that for everyone, that the workers get the restitution. If there are penalties, those would go to the state. But generally, I think all of your offices would try to make workers whole first before collecting penalties. Is that yes? Okay. Another question is specifically how labor advocates or worker advocates can help build cases for your offices. And I will say, I certainly, when I was the New York AG's office, we worked so closely with unions and worker organizations, and they would often bring us cases and say, like, here, it's all ready to go. It's like with a bow. And then when we would unwrap it, there was like a lot of work to do. And sometimes I hear from prosecutors that, that worker advocates will refer cases to them that like they can't really do that much with. So how can advocacy groups help to, like, what should they bring to prosecutors' offices to help build these cases? And I'm not going to call on anyone if you just want to unmute and jump in. Okay, Jose?
Well, yeah, I'll just go quickly and say that, obviously it depends on the state and the statute, but I think what's really important, and everyone has touched on this, is that communication. Obviously, our offices, enforcement offices have an obligation, have a responsibility to be in touch with working people in our community, with workers' organizations in their community, and should work to create an environment where workers and their representatives know that they have an open door. But it is going to be, and just to remind folks, listen, we're 6 months into our term here in Travis County, so we have a lot of learning to do. But I think we're gonna work together to learn how to successfully prosecute these cases, and I think that communication is really key.
Anyone else want to jump in? Susan?
Yeah, in terms of meeting and connecting with our victims and witnesses in this case, our advocacy group was very important in making that happen. They were concerned about coming to a public government building, for example, to meet and talk to us. And even though we do have a very robust victim witness program with people who are primary speaking Spanish, which our victims and witnesses were, it was important in terms of their comfort to have a place where they felt safe. And so they were very generous in hosting preparation meetings, and then also general meetings for people who had questions for us. So that was absolutely essential. And in some instances, we had some people who were witnesses. They could corroborate what people were telling us, which was very important. When you might have a situation where it's he said, we would have these witnesses that corroborate what the victim is saying.
Great, thank you. And the worker organization, I assume, is the SETUL in Minneapolis, which
That's
is like
correct.
Right. It's a worker. SETUL is a worker center, and there are organizations like SETUL in, all throughout the country, like the organization that Jose used to lead, like Towards Justice in Colorado. There are so many different worker organizations that can help. And really, for us in New York, they certainly always served as a bridge and helped connect workers to government and helped government reach workers, so that there was a real, so the government was really responsive to the needs on the ground. Another question that came up was about case studies, and are there any case studies as to the impact, or more like analysis of the impact, the deterrent impact of criminal prosecution? And this is something that, I've been saying for a while, it would be really useful for someone to write their PhD dissertation on this. But do any of you have any, I certainly have an anecdotal sense that there's powerful deterrence. There was a recent paper by a Duke professor, Matt Johnson, about the deterrence of press coverage of, OSHA issuing press releases and how that affected peer employers in the same industry and geographic area. But do any of you have any sense? Susan, you talked a little about the deterrent impact on general contractors. Do any of you have any other sense of the deterrence from criminal prosecution, even if it's just anecdotal?
Go, please.
Go ahead, Jose.
No, please.
Thank you. Yeah, we had another business that we prosecuted, a husband and wife business that we prosecuted for workers' compensation insurance fraud. Again, similar criminal business model of misclassifying employees as independent contractors and then not having the mandatory workers' compensation insurance. And they were, I think, sheetrock. I think I have that right. And again, that prosecution, it just sends shockwaves through the construction industry when you have people that are, very openly violating the law and they're making money because they're doing it. And how can they do that and get away with it? So not getting away with it is a great message to send to the community.
Jose, you were going to say something?
Well, I was just going to point out that everyone is well aware. It has been well documented the impact that organized labor has on wages and standards in workplaces, and there is have been some studies on health and safety. And I think what we know intuitively is that a part of the reason for that is that those wage and health and safety standards are better enforced on those work sites because of the presence of organized labor. And so, we can deduce that that enforcement generally has the impact of improving outcomes for working people.
So another question that someone asked that I think is a really great and tough question is, what kinds of employers have been prosecuted in these jurisdictions? Are they the sort of small fish, low person on the totem pole, or have people been able to sort of get higher up the chain in bringing these cases? Anyone want to answer that? Oh, go ahead, Daniel.
I'll say in Philadelphia, my district attorney, he made it clear that he didn't want to target smaller businesses and smaller employers. But, there are limits. So this case, we went after a construction contractor who was doing millions of dollars, multi-millions of dollars in revenue every year. I would consider taking cases against a smaller employer if there was something in addition to wage theft, if they were targeting a specific group of workers because of their race or immigration status, something like that, that was in addition to the basic wage theft. But otherwise, we are primarily targeting medium-sized or larger employers who have the resources to actually know better and should be held to a higher standard.
Yeah, I think this is one of the, when I've had conversations about this, I think this is a real challenge because our joint employment laws make it hard, even civilly, to go up the chain and get joint employer status, say with a general contractor for violations by a sub, or a franchise company for violations by a franchisee. So it's very hard to get joint employment civilly. And then criminally, you have the higher beyond a reasonable doubt standard of proof. So I think it does make it a little bit, I think that is something that is challenging. At the same time, do you have any thoughts about, I think a lot of these cases happen, there's sort of affinity group predatory, like people preying on people who are from their same national origin. And so, is that something that you've seen in some of these cases as well? I mean, I guess, Susan, it sounds like in your case, maybe that was one of the issues.
Our defendant was originally from El Salvador, and a lot of our victims were from Honduras. And the defendant had been in the United States and was a lot more sophisticated, really knew, he knew how to talk to people at state agencies and licensure, et cetera. And our victims were, had very little schooling. They were fleeing poverty and violence and were extremely vulnerable. They had a lot of family at home that was depending on them for the financial resources that they were providing. And the defendant knew that. He knew how vulnerable they were. It was that knowledge of them and actually knowledge of where they lived that gave him the wherewithal to exploit them. And he would brag about how he was a volunteer for ICE and he could help them, and then, but also at the same time, let them know, I know you're undocumented. I have the contacts with ICE. So part of it was that affinity, and then also just working on that fear of what he could do to them.
Thank you. One question that came in from the audience was from someone asking about who was a former wage enforcement agent for the Connecticut Labor Department, who said that when they encountered health and safety violations at work, mostly all they could do was refer the cases to OSHA. And so the question is, how would local prosecutors go after those issues? And one point I can just offer at the outset is that while OSHA does preempt, there is OSHA preemption of state and local enforcement. That preemption is actually fairly limited. It's only in certain cases when there's an OSHA standard, and OSHA preemption does not apply to police powers typically. So I don't know if any of your offices have dealt with the safety and health issues. But there certainly have been cases. I know there've been a number of cases, as I mentioned, where there were trench collapses, including one in Colorado, that Michael helped get the appropriate. It wasn't in his jurisdiction. It was in a neighboring jurisdiction. He helped get the applicable DA involved. There was a case where a roofer fell off of an unsecured roofer fell off a roof in Maine that the Maine AG's office is prosecuting. As I mentioned, in New York, when I was at the AG's office, we brought a couple of cases under child abuse laws or child labor laws. And so there are possibilities in this area. And there is a group, the Center for Progressive Reform, has really been promoting this kind of work and promoting getting prosecutors involved in addressing workplace safety and health matters. Do any of you have anything to add about that in relation to workplace safety and health? Because I know that's something that comes up everywhere.
The only thing I would highlight, Terry, to your point, is that OSHA does not preempt state criminal prosecutions. And for example, the trench collapse case, if we can make out the elements related to any murder or death that would have happened in relation to a trench collapse, the district attorneys have the authority and jurisdiction to bring charges in that type of case.
Great, thank you. One question also that someone asked is like, why is the U.S. Department of Labor not doing this? Do they not have enough investigators to handle the caseload? And can DAs get different results, like higher settlement amounts for workers? And the first question, if you look at the report, there is some information in there about how under-resourced our civil enforcement agencies are. And so, they've been working in an under-resourced environment for quite some time. And so I think, as Jose mentioned, there are incredible people working throughout the country for the U.S. Department of Labor and for state agencies, but often with severe resource limitations. But maybe let's turn to the second question, which is like, can DAs get what kind of results can DAs get that are different from what you can get through civil enforcement?
Well, I mean, let me just start with kind of the obvious here, right? Which is that the Department of Labor has civil enforcement authority, and district attorneys have criminal enforcement authority that could lead ultimately to someone serving time in jail as a starting place. But I will also note, and I referenced this at the beginning, both at my time during my time at the Department of Labor, and I know even more recently that regional offices of the Department of Labor do partner with United States attorneys' offices and with local prosecutors when they can to pursue criminal enforcement when that's appropriate. I don't know that it happens incredibly frequently, but I know it is something that the Department of Labor does from time to time.
Michael, something to add?
Just that as district attorneys and local law enforcement, we are on the ground and we have connections to the groups that are being impacted, and we tend to have stronger connections than perhaps a federal agency might. So in addition to what Jose said, which I completely agree with, I think it's about us being more connected to the local communities that we serve.
And if someone also, I realized we've been talking about civil versus criminal cases without really unpacking a little bit. We're getting to the end of our time, but could one of you really briefly just describe what's the difference between a civil and a criminal case? I mean, I guess that's a hard thing to talk about briefly, but for a labor case, what kinds of factors would you be looking for in a wage theft case, say, or a misclassification case to bring it criminally as opposed to civilly?
Perhaps the easiest way to describe it, just in the brief time we have left, is we're looking at intent. And it's not just one missed check or one bounced check. We're looking at the intent, prior history of the employer, what the employer has done with regards to that employee, but also others in the past, and putting it all together as we would with any criminal case and determining whether we can actually demonstrate and prove criminal intent. And if not, then it might be a civil matter.
Anything to add? So I think we're just about at the end of our time. I want to thank all of you for coming and for speaking. This has been really a wonderful conversation, and I'm so appreciative of the work that all of you are doing on behalf of workers within your states, and really transforming the landscape within your jurisdictions. And so thank you for sharing this work. And I'll turn it over to Jennifer to close us out.
Thanks, Terry. And I have the honor of saying farewell to folks. And thank you again, Terry Gerstein, and to all of our panelists, first for your ongoing work and your leadership, and especially taking time today to share so many vivid examples and ideas for building on this work. And I also want to thank the hundreds of attendees who joined us today for your work. The questions and ideas you added to today's session gave us a really powerful glimpse of the thousands of struggles that workers and advocates are engaged in right now on the ground across the country to combat employer abuses and to seek justice for workers. And I think one of many things that is clear from today's discussion is that there are roles for everyone to play in this work. We clearly need more of the smart and innovative approaches to prosecution that we heard about today, alongside more worker organizing, strong engagement from policymakers and state and federal agencies, unions, worker centers, and other advocates. Everyone who attended will receive an email with resources, including Terry's new report, the recording of today's webinar. I think you just received a reminder that you can follow EPI on social media at Economic Policy, and visit our website for lots more information on this and other subjects. So on behalf of EPI and the EARN Network, thank